Government shutdown that is still underway. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers are working without pay for now or staying home on furlough.
Not exactly what people wanted for Christmas.
Right.
Mr. Trump, though, sent Vice President Mike Pence to Capitol Hill on Saturday to try to work out a resolution. CNN's Sarah Westwood reports so far, there's no deal.
President Trump is still not signaling what he'd consider in terms of a deal that could get 10 Senate Democrats on board and start the process of reopening the government. But White House officials say the president is not budging from his demand for $5 billion for the border wall, and they say that money has to be used for the construction of a physical barrier along the southern border. They say it can't just be used for border security in general, which is one of several potential options that had been floating around Capitol Hill amid the shutdown talks. But make no mistake, despite that current hardline stance, the president has been all over the map when it comes to the funding fight. First, saying that he would be proud to accept responsibility for a shutdown if it was over money for his border wall. Then, through aides, signaling that he might be willing to entertain a temporary spending deal passed by the Senate that would have kept the government open through February 8th. And finally, by Thursday, rallying House Republicans to pass a funding mechanism that did contain $5 billion for the wall, buckling under pressure from conservative allies on Capitol Hill and in the media to avoid what they described as a surrender on the border wall. Now, the president held a lunch here at the White House on Saturday with Republican lawmakers. No Democrats were in attendance, and those who did attend were mostly conservative allies like Congressman Mark Meadows, Jim Jordan, Senator Lindsey Graham, allies of the president who already agree with him when it comes to the strategy behind the shutdown. And as Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said earlier Saturday, the logjam will persist until the president huddles with Senate Democrats to talk about a potential compromise. But the lack of clarity surrounding what exactly the president might be willing to entertain has caused headaches for some lawmakers who really have no idea what kind of deal the president might support beyond that hardline stance for $5 billion. Vice President Mike Pence is leading negotiations for the White House side. But earlier this week, Pence told lawmakers that the president might be inclined to sign that temporary spending deal, something that turned out not to be true. But heading into Christmas, both sides appear very entrenched. Washington appears poised to enter what could be a lengthy shutdown, the president canceling his plans to travel to West Palm Beach, Florida over the holiday amid the legislative logjam. Sarah Westwood, CNN, the White House.
And that's not the only thing the president is facing. A second senior U.S. official has quit over President Trump's decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. The person, Brett McGurk, was a key diplomat in the region. He worked as the U.S. special envoy to the international coalition fighting ISIS.
He was in Iraq and had just finished briefing partners that the U.S. would stay in Syria when he learned President Trump had reversed course. His resignation on Friday came just one day after U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis quit over the same thing.
And this tweet from the U.S. president claiming not to know his own envoy. He belittled McGurk as an Obama holdover and, quote, grandstander who was going to leave the administration soon anyway.
Joining me now is political analyst Peter Matthews, a frequent guest of our program. Peter, thanks for being with us.
Good to be here, Natalie.
All right. It's the holidays. Happy holidays to you. I don't know how much happy holidays is going around Washington, because this is the first time in 40 years the government will have been closed 3 times in 1 year. And now Congress says, well, we'll take it up after Christmas.
Emerald Bay, the ultimate.
And who is to blame for it?
Well, they almost had a compromise worked out, just a few days ago. And then President Trump threw a tantrum and said he wanted money for the wall and he's not backing down, because what happened was someone on Fox News said he was backing down. He shouldn't do that. Always looking towards his base, he says, no, I'm not going to go for the deal. And the deal was off. And so the whole thing ended up falling apart. I would blame him the most for it, actually, in the end. At this point, anyway.
Yeah. Do you think that President Trump is surprised that the hardliners will hold him to this wall? I mean, he did promise it. He did say Mexico would pay for it. That's not going to happen. And then he seems willing to compromise. But then those who really believe in him say, wait a minute, you're not doing us right.
He's always concerned about those really hardcore right-wingers who he may lose, and a few percent of the loss among them could cost him the election next time, he thinks. At this point, he's not going to be able to win anyway because very few people really support him percent-wise, but he's really beholden to that right-wing, extreme right-wing group that he chooses to try to placate them each time, and he's causing a disaster for himself and for the country, in a sense, and chaos, to say the very least. It's not good what he's facing right now, with the stock market crash going down and all the other things happening. A lot of it has to do with this uncertainty bringing about by this kind of behavior.
Right. There's so much going on with his presidency. This is probably the last thing that people wanted to deal with, a government shutdown. But here we are. Democrats indicate they have no plans to fund a wall. Never did. Let's listen to the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, talking about the shutdown. And then after that, Democrat leader Chuck Schumer. And then we'll talk about it.
Democrats have rejected that reasonable request. They've refused to meet President Trump halfway and provide even one-fifth of the resources for the border they were willing to provide just a few months ago. Just a few months ago. There's no bright line of principle that separates hundreds of miles of physical barriers in 2006 from new physical barriers in 2018.
It will never pass the Senate. Not today, not next week, not next year. So, Mr. President, President Trump, if you want to open the government, you must abandon the wall. Plain and simple.
Is it plain and simple like that, Peter, do you think?
It really is, because a majority of the Congress does not want the wall. That includes a large number of Republicans who are concerned about that. And yet he wants to be very strong-headed about it and say, we have to have the wall, because he thinks he campaigned on it, he has to stick to his campaign promise. But it's bringing the whole party, his own party is going to be brought down because of that. Look what happened in the election. The midterm showed that people who were against that wall and want to fix the immigration problem in a different, better way won the landslide victory. The Democratic Party won the victory, and I don't know why Trump didn't see that and see he's going the wrong approach is what he's doing right now.
If he does not get his wall, then what for his re-election chances?
Well, I'll tell you what, I don't think as it's going right now, he's going to get reelected to begin with. And if he doesn't get his wall, he'll probably lose some of his own hardcore base of support, but he's not going to gain anyone else's support because of all the other things he's done that has really jeopardized the country and the policies of the country and the feeling of who we really are as a people. So he's not going to win either way, in my view. If he continues this way, it's not going to help. If he changes his ways, it might help a little bit. I'm not sure it'll be enough to get him over the top in 2020.
Well, let's discuss for a moment the other top story this week. First, the Secretary of Defense quitting in part over Mr. Trump's decision to pull troops out of Syria. Now, another top official is quitting for the same reason. Brett McGurk was a special envoy fighting ISIS in the Middle East. President Trump says his quitting is no big deal. Is it?
It's a very big deal because not only he was the envoy to the coalition fighting ISIS, and as importantly, he was a close ally of General and Defense Secretary Mattis. And with Mattis going and then him following suit right after it, it's a 1-2 punch for showing the world that President Trump is losing some of the best talent that he has in the government, that he had in the government. And it's very destabilizing for people to think, what can this president do? He's done not so well even with such good support. Now what will he do without this kind of support and this kind of talent? And it's a very dangerous thing that's happening right now. We're in a very critical juncture in so many ways in this presidency and what's come of it so far, Natalie.
All right, we'll wait and see what happens next with this story. And, of course, the government shutdown. Peter Matthews, as always, we really appreciate your insights.
Thank you. Take care, Natalie.
Moving on now to developments in Washington, D.C., the resignation of a second senior U.S. official in protest of President Trump's decision to pull U.S. forces out of Syria. Brett McGurk was America's top diplomat, the diplomatic person in the global fight against ISIS. Despite battlefield gains, McGurk believed that the mission was not finished, and he viewed President Trump's move as reckless. Let's bring in CNN's Gul Tuzuz following the story live for us in Istanbul. And Gul, first of all, tell us more about the integral role that McGurk played in that region.
He had probably the hardest job in the administration. He was the special presidential envoy to the global coalition to combat ISIS. That meant that he had to corral dozens of different actors and nations in the region into coming together to form the backbone of the fight against ISIS. That meant that he was a mainstay in the region. You could see him traveling from into Iraq to Syria, and really he was the man who was seen as the architect of the U.S. policy. And here, for example, in Turkey, people would watch to see what McGurk was going to say and do, and what the U.S. was going to do in Syria. He brought, years of experience, having been instrumental in the building of that coalition to combat ISIS. And over his tenure, you could see that ISIS, which held vast swaths of territory across Iraq and Syria, has now been degraded. They still maintain a presence there, and there are pockets of it along the border with Iraq and Syria where they have been mounting attacks again. But he really, McGurk, was instrumental in putting together this rather successful fight against ISIS, and his departure is definitely going to be leaving a big gap, coupled with the resignation of Mattis as well. And to have the U.S. president coming out and saying that he didn't know McGurk, well, that's just disingenuous at best.
It was a very odd tweet, to say the least. Has the Turkish government addressed this move?
Turkey came out, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan came out and said that they welcomed the U.S.'s decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. There were only about 2,000 of those troops, but really they had an impact that was outsized for their numbers. They were instrumental in beating back ISIS, and really this announcement that the U.S. is pulling out of Syria puts the U.S.'s main ally on the ground in Syria, a Kurdish fighting force, in jeopardy. That Kurdish fighting force is seen by Turkey to be an extension of a terrorist group that they have here at home. So really, with the U.S.'s departure, what's going to happen to that Kurdish fighting force as they become exposed to the possibility of a Turkish incursion into Syria? Not to say the least of which, what's going to happen to the fight against ISIS? Those remaining remnants of ISIS are there, and they are a security threat, not just to Iraq and Syria, but of course to the world.
Gul Tuzuz live for us in Istanbul.